Last time we spoke about the complicated story of Xinjiang. Xinjiang, though part of China since the Han Dynasty, had a distinct cultural and geographic identity aligned more with Central Asia than China's east. Its remote mountainous landscapes divided its regions and isolated its ethnic groups, which included Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Hui Muslims, amongst countless others. Yang Zongxin, Xinjiang's Republican governor, ruled with shrewd, divisive tactics, maintaining peace by balancing loyalties but alienating many. His rule ended in 1928 when an ambitious subordinate, Fan Yuan, assassinated him, marking a turning point. Yang attended a banquet hosted by Fan where disguised soldiers fired upon him, mortally wounding him. Fan seized power but was soon defeated and executed by Jin, who then became the ruler of Xinjiang. Jin enforced strict policies favoring Han Chinese officials and worsening the economy. He raised taxes, restricted Muslim customs, and monopolized industry. His annexation of the Kumul Khanate in 1931 incited unrest amongst the local Uyghurs, setting the stage for rebellion. This episode is the beginning of the Kumul Rebellion. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a rather comical episode on Churchill drinking at the White House with FDR. Over on Echoes of War, we just covered the evolution of the Roman Republican Army, and are soon set to be doing a brand new smaller series on World War I. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And hey, it's Christmas time. You can gift a Patreon account to a history-minded friend or family member. So last we left off, things had reached a boiling point in Kumul. The explosion at Kumul would begin mostly as a result of a religious and cultural slight against the Muslim population, both Turkic-speaking and Tongan. They became offended, and they banded together against the Chinese officials. As a result of the new administration and annexation of the Kumul Khanate, a young Han named Chong Mu from Gansu was appointed tax collector and chief of police over the small village of Xiaopu, which is just due north of Kumul. According to a Nanjing official named Wu Qian, this Chang Mu was a wastrel whose conduct soon became a public scandal. In early 1931, Chang Mu met a pretty Turkic Muslim girl in Xiaopu, and he tried to force her father, a Uyghur called Sali, to give him her hand in marriage. Now, for those who are unaware, Sharia law specifically prohibits marriage between Muslim women and men of other religions. What followed is described by two differing accounts. The first account has it that on April the 4th of 1931, Chang Mu was invited to eat at a girl's house. Oh my god, it's another banquet. Allegedly, this was in honor of their forthcoming wedding. During the dinner, Chang Mu was attacked by Uyghurs and slaughtered alongside 32 members of his personal bodyguard. It was further implied by our friend Wu Qian, Chang Mu had already seduced the girl and that the ulama, those being Islamic scholars who act as a sort of authority under Sharia law, upon discovering so, took it upon themselves to correct the situation. On the night of the proposed ceremony, a mob appeared in the streets of Xiaopu. Chang Mu and his guard detail were already thoroughly drunk by this time, and they were easily overcome by the very pissed-off Uyghurs. All were killed, including the poor Uyghur girl. The Uyghurs then took 30 rifles from the dead, and they turned their attention towards the Gansu Chinese, who were said to number about 100 families in the area. All of them were massacred and, quote, had their heads buried in the soil of their farms. Following this, the Uyghurs marched upon the Chinese outposts at Tuluhu and Lai Meihe, killing their garrisons and tax collectors while acquiring even more weapons. Better armed, the Uyghurs elected to make a move against Kumul. Kumul held an overwhelming Uyghur majority and easily fell into the hands of the rebels with little to no fighting. Most of the Han fled into the fortified Old City, barring its gates. The Han caught outside the Old City were massacred brutally. Soon the rebel forces controlled Kumul's Muslim part of the city and the surrounding countryside, but the provincial forces remained secure within the Old City and its key arsenal. It is unclear whether the Xiaopu incident was carefully planned prior or simply just came into being. Regardless, it was a spark that ignited a much larger rebellion. According to Mildred Cable and Francesca French, two members of the China Inland Mission who resided in Xiaopu at the time, it was indeed a systematically planned rebellion. They said, quote, "While officials surreptitiously transferred their wealth to a place of safety, the instigators of trouble were equally persistent in their secret preparations for war. Camels and mules were requisitioned to transport weapons and ammunition and stocks of food over little-known tracks that they might be stored in mountain caves known only to a few. Steady streams of small caravans carrying ammunition to the mountains came from the South Road, from Tunwang, and across the most lonely tracks of the desert connecting Gansu with Barke. All these converged on the Khan's summer palace grounds in Arhim, and the stronghold of Bardash was stocked with huge supplies of food and firearms." Yulbars Khan, the former chancellor of Moksu Shah, claimed he was in Tancha, escaping heat when the fighting began. Many speculate that he had a hand in the planning of the uprising. Cable and French argued that the Tongan population of Kumul also joined the rebellion quite early on. The insurgents of Kumul were quickly joined by neighboring Kyrgyz of the Karlaktak, who had held grievances against Jin as he had imposed Chinese officials upon them in 1929. According to Hua Chen, the Barkul and Kazakhs in the area also joined the rebellion. Thus Jin had succeeded in alienating the Turkic-speaking peoples of northeastern Xinjiang, and now he had a full-scale Muslim rising on his hands. Jin reacted with a strong show of force despite his Commissioner of Education, Liao Wenlong, and the Commissioner of Reconstruction, Yan Yushan, both arguing for a policy of conciliation. Jin ordered troops to crack down on the rebels without mercy. Meanwhile, back in Kumul, the rebels were unable to breach the Old City, so they fanned out into the countryside hunting Han settlers and soldiers down. According to the British Vice Consul General at Kashgar, R.P. Watts, an initial detachment of 300 troops sent by Jin to relieve Kumul Old City were ambushed and killed nearly to a man. It's also implied they had lost so easily because many of them were sleeping off the effects of opium. Despite the initial success, the rebels were unable to prevent provincial forces led by Zhu Jiaqi, the Taoyuan of Aksu, from relieving the Old City. By late April, the siege was lifted, Zhu Jiaqi occupied the Old City, and he ordered his second-in-command, Zhong Faiyu, to occupy Kumul's Muslim quarters. The rebels still controlled the countryside, and they were harassing Zhu Jiaqi's forces wherever they strayed a bit too far from their forts, but overall, were not much of a match. Meanwhile, Chinese troops under the leadership of Zhong Faiyu began a series of reprisal massacres against Muslim civilians in Kumul and the surrounding villages. The Uyghur leaders quickly determined they needed external help in the rebellion against Jin. According to testimony from Yulbars Khan, they sent an appeal to the KMT government in Nanjing. Then in June of 1931, Yulbars Khan was chosen, most likely because he was fluent in Mandarin, to head out and secretly go to Nanjing to carry out the appeal. Along the way, Yulbars went to Suzhou to meet with Ma Chong Ying, known as the youngest and most extreme of the 5 Ma Tongan warlords. Ma Chong Ying was a Gansu native. Very little is known about his early years, nor about his father, but he shared the same paternal grandfather of the Gansu Qinghai warlords, Ma Puqing and Ma Pufang. He was also distantly related to the Gansu Ningxia warlords, Ma Honghui and Ma Hongping. And yes, there's going to be a lot of Ma's in this episode. Altogether, the 5 were known as the 5 Ma warlord clique. Ma Chong Ying entered military service in 1924 at the age of 14 when he joined a local Muslim militia. A year later, the Kuomingzheng forces of Fang Yusung invaded Guangzhou, but the Tongan warlords of Western Gansu remained for the most part untouched. Ma Chong Ying became an officer for the forces of his uncle, Ma Kuchong, and he laid a siege and captured the important city of Hujo on his own initiative. His troops easily defeated reinforcements sent to relieve the city under the command of Ma Lin. With this great victory, at the age of only 16, Ma Chong Ying earned the reputation of being a military genius, and he was nicknamed Ma Su Ling, or Little Commander. His triumph would be short-lived, however, for his superior, Ma Kucheng, had not ordered the seizure of Hujo and dismissed his nephew for insubordination. Thus Ma Chong Ying took his men to Xinying in Qinghai, and there he began building a private army. The Kuomingzheng eventually left Gansu after devastating it. In 1927, the northwestern parts of Gansu were hit by a massive earthquake, and this combined with Feng Yusung's regional commander, Lui Yufan, using much of its land for opium cultivation, led to mass famine. In the spring of 1928, the northwestern Tongans began a revolt against the Kuomingzheng, led by the Muslim general Ma Tingxiang. Ma Chong Ying tossed his lot into the fighting, leading to 3 successive attacks against the Kuomingzheng at Hujo. According to Robert Eckfall, an American traveler in the region, the revolt had by this time assumed all the aspects of a holy war. Chanting prayers, 40 or 50,000 fighters went into battle with fanatical zeal. The young rebel leader, Ma Chong Ying, seemed to bear a charmed life and by his reckless courage gained the utmost in obedience and devotion from his ruffian troops. The Chinese were panic-stricken at the desperate courage of the Muslims, but eventually, by machine gun fire and light artillery, proved superior. Alongside this, American diplomats reported that the famine and war in Gansu had reduced many to cannibalism, with a possible 2 million people dying between 1926 to 1929. One of the many to die was Ma Chong Ying's father, who was executed by Liu Yufan, a reprisal against him for his actions in 1929. That year, Ma Chong Ying had strengthened his position by defeating several Kuomingzheng forces. He traveled to Nanjing, where he enrolled briefly at the military academy there. Rumors have it, there he offered his services to the KMT on understanding that if he could win over Xinjiang, that they would recognize him. After departing Nanjing, he traveled to Zhongwei, along the Yellow River, where he joined his army before marching across the southern fields of the Alashan Desert to head into northwestern Gansu. There he seized control over 4 districts, Ganzhou, Suzhou, Anxi, and Tunhuang. Thus, by the time of the Kumul uprising of April of 1931, Ma Chong Ying had established himself the Tongan warlord over northwestern Gansu. In June of that year, Yulbars Khan visited him at Suzhou while en route to Nanjing. After a dinner, Ma Chong Ying asked Yulbars what was going on with the Kumul Rebellion, and the state of Kumul for that matter. Ma Chong Ying then proceeded to criticize Jin ShuJen, whom he thought was unfit to govern Xinjiang. Upon hearing the criticism, Yulbars disclosed why he was actually going to Nanjing. Yulbars told him that many in Gansu did not support Jin, and that he was appealing to Nanjing to see if Jin could be replaced with a new governor. Ma Chong Ying sat silently for some time before asking if Yulbars had any personal contacts in Nanjing, to which he replied he did not. He then advised Yulbars to not go to Nanjing because of 3 reasons. Reason number 1, the Kuomintang had just completed its northern expedition, and it was in need of stability, so it was not in a position to replace its frontier governors, despite any shortcomings they might have. Number 2, even if Nanjing's government agreed to remove Jin ShuJen, implementing the decision would likely take 2 to 3 years due to the vast distances involved. And number 3, Jin's greed would likely make him unwilling to step down, and he might even seek support from a foreign power to secure his position. Under these 3 circumstances, Xinjiang could potentially come under foreign control. The points were very sound. However, Yulbars stated that the people had sent him to Nanjing. What should he do if he failed? To this, Ma Chong Ying replied, "I have a way. I can meet the demands of the Uyghurs of Hanmi in the name of Muslim Brotherhood. I shall take my army into Xinjiang. First, I shall alleviate the suffering of the Uyghurs of Hanmi. Then I shall drive Jin ShuJen from the stage by force of arms." Now, a lot of this is conjecture, as it would seem impossible Ma Chong Ying spontaneously decided to invade Xinjiang over dinner. Ma Chong Ying was interested in the Kumul uprising long before the arrival of Yulbars in Suzhou, and based on other sources, it seems Yulbars was well aware of this prior to his visit. Ma Chong Ying most likely had decent information on the political ongoings of Xinjiang, as 2 Muslim Turks from Istanbul had traveled to northwestern Gansu from Urumqi in early 1931, and they entered Ma Chong Ying's military HQ. One was Kumul Rebellion, who went on to become his chief of staff. Ma Chong Ying was also gun-running in places like Kumul, meaning he would have a lot of intel. Ma Chong Ying's power base in Kanzhou was also temporary, as pointed out by Mildred Cable and Francesca French, based on the assumption of the paralyzing effect of frightfulness in action. And as a method of temporary invasion, it answered his purpose well, but it never served him on the basis of true conquest, nor did he ever establish rule over one single acre of land which he invaded. His was the method of the locust, and his army was also viewed as a plague. It came, it devoured, and when it passed over, the patient, constructively minded peasants instantly began to repair the damage done to their fields, and to the Begensons to replace those who had been swept away in his train. In 1931, Ma Chong Ying's private army was not that large. It was perhaps no more than 1,000 men, and given the account of Mildred Cable and Francesca French, his army had to roam around like locusts to survive. Ma Chong Ying was a very ambitious and young warlord, who, like many in this part of China, dreamed of carving out a Muslim empire in Central Asia. In the spring of 1931, Ma Chong Ying had only 2 possible directions to take. One was through China proper, where he would most likely have to face his uncle, Ma Pufang, whom at this time he was sort of in a propaganda war with. The other was to go through Xinjiang, where it seemed he could receive aid from other Muslim groups seeking to be rid of Jin ShuJen. Ma Chong Ying assembled a force of 500 Tongan cavalry and swiftly crossed the desert between Anxi and Kumul during the heat of midsummer, arriving in the oasis on the 20th of June, at about the same time as the French Citron expedition. The French Citron expedition got to see an encounter between Ma Chong Ying's Tongan cavalry and some Chinese machine gun detachments outside of the village of Yikushu. The French account indicated that the Chinese forces also had some Mongol soldiers with them, decisively beating back the Tongan riders. After witnessing this, the French headed for Kumul's old city, where they found it in a state of chaos. Everyone within the city was busy organizing defenses. The French were taken immediately to the local Chinese commander, Zhu Qi, and as they made their way, they could see anxious Muslims peering out of their windows, and on telegraph poles were heads, hearts, and livers, most likely from captured insurgents. Commander Zhu gave the French permission to continue to Urumqi, stating that they could do it at their own risk. Most of the French departed on July the 1st, leaving behind 3 members at the old city, who would become eyewitnesses to Ma Chong Ying's attack. On July the 3rd, Ma Chong Ying dispatched 2 messengers to Zhu Qi, barring the following message. By order of the National Government of China, I have been appointed Commander-in-Chief of all military forces of Gansu and Xinjiang. Having assumed my new occasional pistol shot could be heard as hand-to-hand fighting began on the wall itself. Just when the place seemed to be doomed, a machine gun, which up to this had been silent, suddenly came to life. Emplaced in a blockhouse flanking the wall, it opened fire, mowing down the assault, and the glacis was soon cleared out for heaps of corpses. Ma Chong Ying's Tongan cavalry force lacked heavy artillery necessary to breach the old city walls. 3 separate attacks were made on the night of the 3rd, all beaten back. Zhu Qi, a military veteran, had zero intention of surrendering to the so-called Little Commander, whom he dismissed as a thieving cub. Ma Chong Ying seemed to have little stomach for siege warfare, so on the 5th he led a large portion of his Tongan cavalry away from the Kumul Old City. By doing so, he left roughly 1,000 Uyghur insurgents with a handful of Tongans to continue a siege against the Old City, who had about 2,000 provincial troops defending them. Zhu Qi was unaware of Ma Chong Ying's true purpose, so he elected not to sortie, fearing a trap. Meanwhile, Ma Chong Ying led his riders over the Karlik Tag to Barkul, surprising its defenders. Barkul would end up surrendering without much of a struggle. The commander at Barkul, named Hujo, handed over 2,000 rifles and opened Barkul's arsenal to Ma Chong Ying. Ma Chong Ying left a 100-man garrison to capture the town as he turned south. According to Wu Qian, the sudden small victories of the young commander emboldened other groups to join his cause, such as the Kazakhs and Tungans north of Karlik Tag. By mid-July, Muslim insurgents were effectively controlling the entire territory of the old Kumul Khanate, from Xinxingjia to Iwanchuan. Groups of invading Tungans from Gansu formed an alliance with the Muslims of Xinjiang, notably from Xinxingjia, and Barkul to hold the siege of Kumul City. Ma Chong Ying seemed to also hold the full support of indigenous Muslims in the area, whether it be Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uyghur, or Xinjiang Tungans. Jin ShuJen received word of the young commander, leading a force of Tongan cavalry attacking various places. It seemed his next target was to be Qiqiaoqing. Jin ShuJen appointed his chief secretary, Liu Xiaozu, to be his commander-in-chief of the provincial forces. Tu Qikuo and Sheng Xucai were to be his joint chiefs of staff. Liu Xiaozu was the younger brother to Jin ShuJen, a civilian with little to no military experience, and he was the bitter rival of the current commissioner for military affairs at Urumqi, Jin ShuXin. Liu Xiaozu mustered a force roughly 1,000 strong of men with little to no military experience or training. They were immediately tossed over to Qiqiaoqing with orders to halt the Tongan advance, pending further reinforcements. Shortly after their arrival, the troops were met by a surprise night attack and killed nearly to a man. Their commander, Tu Qikuo, committed suicide in disgrace. According to Kamal Kaya Afide, the Tongans were led personally by Ma Chong Ying during the daring attack. He had taken his forces into the oasis through a little-known trail in Karliktag and Bokdoula after his capture of Barkul. Following this victory, Ma Chong Ying returned to Kumul City to see if the siege was providing any results. This was a rather bizarre decision, as Jin ShuJen's capital of Urumqi was basically wide open for the taking. But perhaps the young commander had overestimated his enemy. When Ma Chong Ying arrived at Kumul City, the besiegers' morale improved greatly. Between July the 3rd to October the 16th, over 43 attacks had been levied against the Chinese garrison. The Tongans dug trenches and built barricades trying to storm the walls. Meanwhile, within the old city walls, the besieged people were forced to eat their camels, horses, and mules to survive. By October the 1st, the defenders were reduced to a ration of just 750 grams of cowling flour per day. They were expected to run out by the end of the month. Likewise, ammunition was running low, prompting Zhu Juqi to resort to more archaic weapons such as firing fire arrows and using Dao swords that the man had found preserved in the arsenal going back to the time of Zhou Zongtang's campaign in the 19th century. One of the French expeditionaries reported the only thing being sold in the bazaars at this time was opium. One could not even obtain oil, as it was boiled and hurled over the walls against the attackers. The Tongans attempted numerous times to breach the walls using mines, but they lacked sufficient powder to create large enough explosions. On one occasion, a breach was made in the walls, but the defenders were quickly able to block the hole with wool before the attackers could get through. Trying to picture how that went down, it's pretty interesting to shove wool in the breach. Afterwards, a ditch was dug around the walls, and it was flooded so the Tongan trenches would be unable to continue their mining operations. Siege warfare is pretty neat, isn't it? Horrible to be sure, but there's a lot of ingenuity involved. By mid-October, the defenders were very desperate. According to the French expeditionaries, inside, after 108 days of siege, the defenders sortied out of the town on October the 16th and tried to reach Urumqi. What sustained the men was opium. They could not have held out without it, and so long as it lasted, no strenuous effort was demanded of them. They could get along on practically no food. At night, the opium lamps of the sentries could be seen sparkling like little stars along the length of the ramparts. The whole garrison was in fact intoxicated. It was fantastic. It is quite probable the defenders chose to make a break for it because they were a majority Han Chinese, and they greatly feared their fate if the Tongans got in. If you know your Islamic history, well, you know what would happen. Ma Chong Ying had refused any terms other than unconditional surrender, and given the feelings of the Kumul Muslim insurgents, it seemed highly unlikely any prisoners would be taken. Regardless, the siege had delayed the Tongans for a long time, allowing Jin ShuJen to hastily organize provincial forces at Urumqi. After his first military campaign had failed so horrendously, Jin ShuJen now ordered Tsen Punsag Gugin, the living Buddha of Xinjiang, of the Torgut Mongols, to lead his famous Torgut cavalry regiment against the Tongans at Kumul. The Torgut troops were by far the very best available at the time to Jin, and the most capable to go one-on-one with Tongans. However, Tsen Punsag Gugin was one of the many Torguts who had grievances with Jin over his policy of enforcing Han Chinese officials upon his people. Moreover, a plot had recently been discovered that one of his subordinates had been paid off to assassinate him. Tsen Punsag Gugin suspected Jin ShuJen to be the culprit to this plot, and when the said assassins fled to Urumqi, Jin ShuJen refused to hand them over for justice, all but confirming his suspicions. Thus, Zitsin Putsagugin refused to become involved in the war over Kumul and instead took his forces to Kahar Shah as a demonstration of power. Lacking sufficient numbers or reliable Han Chinese troops, Jin turned next to the White Russian community. Liu Shaozi, who proved himself a complete moron at military matters, was replaced with Chang Puyuan, the military commander of the Ili region, who also happened to be in the region where most White Russians resided. Chang Peyuan would work by rallying White Russian volunteers who more or less refused to fight for the Chinese. That was, of course, until Jin ShuJen threatened to repatriate them to Stalin's USSR. In late September, Chang Peyuan had a force headed by 250 White Russians under the leadership of Colonel Papengut, with the mission of relieving Kumul Old City. During this time, Ma Chong Ying decided to march upon the capital, drawing most of his Tongan cavalry away from Kumul, heading westwards along the Qichaoqing Road. This took him directly into the path of the advancing White Russians, who began skirmishing around the village of Liaocun. At some point, Ma Chong Ying was seriously wounded, shot through both of his legs. Despite this, both sides had negligible casualties. Yet as a result of his grievous injury, a large portion of Ma Chong Ying's Tongan riders retreated back into Northwestern Gansu. Rumor has it at this time, Ma Chong Ying was bought off by Jin ShuJen. Regardless, he had to take a prolonged time to recuperate, and he was well away from the front lines. Once safely across the Gansu-Xinjiang frontier, Ma Chong Ying handed control of his 4 districts of Dunhuang, Anxi, Yumen, and Hujo to his uncle, Ma Pufang. Meanwhile, Chang Peyuan's forces with Papangut's White Russians in the spearhead were still advancing towards Kumul Old City. They managed to relieve it on November the 1st. The victorious Chinese troops sacked Kumul as a reward, and that reward was denied to the White Russian forces. The provincial troops then performed a systematic destruction of large portions of Kumul, leveling entire villages and terrorizing the population. Jie Zhiqi had returned to Urumqi, but his lieutenant, Xing Faiyu, remained at Kumul and began a series of mass executions. The reprisals were so heinous, all of the Uyghurs who had remained neutral during the ordeal threw their lot in with the rebellion. Refugees began to pour westwards towards Turfan, while Uyghur insurgents withdrew to Karliktag, most notably to their well-stocked mountain fort at Bardash. Those who went to Bardash unleashed a guerrilla-style warfare against Jin ShuJen's troops in collaboration with Ma Chong Ying's Tongans, who awaited their leader in Xinjiang. A communication network led from Bardash to Anxi for this purpose. Thus, while Ma Chong Ying was licking his wounds, he was reorganizing his forces for another attack. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I'm releasing 2 Christmas-themed episodes. The first covers Sir Winston Churchill and President FDR getting drunk at the White House over the Christmas holidays. The other episode covers Christmas on Guadalcanal in 1942. Over on Echoes of War, we just covered the evolution of the Roman Republic Army, the Dutch naval war against Japan in the Pacific War, and the Second Punic War, with much more to come. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will be tackling next. And hey, it's Christmas time. Why not gift a Patreon account to a history-minded friend or family member? Thus, the Kumul Rebellion had just been unleashed. Those who were oppressed were gradually forming a rebellious coalition against Jin ShuJen. Although Ma Chong Ying had literally been cut down at the leg, so to say, he was not down for the count. The rebellion had only just begun.